but I think it's important to suss out the difference a little bit to ensure that we all start from the same understanding of the difference between the two methods. I'll run through some typical ones that I think are used, at least in our department, but probably they're used more broadly within our field of environmental enforcement. And then I want to spend the most of the time that I have here on a couple of examples that I think make concrete the difference between qualitative and quantitative measures, but also how the two dovetail with one another and how they're ultimately best used in cooperation in an integrated performance measurement strategy. So next slide. This table here really just lays out the difference between quantitative and qualitative measures as I understand them and as I've seen them used in the past over the course of my career. So with quantitative, you're really looking at counting things and trying to use a standardized method to do that and standardized methodologies to draw out conclusions. So how much something happens, how often it happens, are usually the area of focus. In our case, with the work that we do, often we're counting how many enforcement actions we take, what kind of penalties are obtained through court processes, and the impact that that has on the rate of reoffense or recidivism. On the qualitative side, it's more about the underlying understandings of people and regulatees inside that process. So how do they understand their obligations? What are the reasons that underpin their non-compliance? And whereas with quantitative, you end up with numbers and statistics. With qualitative, you usually end up with much richer and deeper descriptive narratives to work with. So that is really the major differences between the two. Maybe it might be worth pointing out that final row where with quantitative you do have some capacity to generalize the results, although it's often more difficult than is generally assumed. Whereas with qualitative, you can't really generalize the results as easily, but you can look for the capacity within your groups to explore hypothetical scenarios, which can have equal value. So I'll move to the next slide. So when is it that qualitative measures become really something that should come to the fore and maybe even be done in the absence of quantitative measures? So qualitative measures usually are used when the subject is new and unfamiliar. So one can imagine a situation where there is a new kind of environmental concern, and there is some rumblings of the government's need to regulate in that area, but you have a situation where you don't yet understand the sector as well as you'd like to. You don't understand the players, and as a result, you're not even really sure what questions to ask yet and where to focus your study. So qualitative information obtained through focus groups and interviews and observation are usually the way to start because they lay down a basic understanding which can then lead to more quantitative exercises in the future. There's an interesting one here, the fourth bullet that I have down there. We deal with situations, I think, quite frequently in environmental enforcement where the use of baselines and then sample groups and varying your approach on the basis of trying to maintain methodological integrity is not always palatable. So put more practically, you can imagine a situation where you have both your experimental group and your baseline group. Can you really go forward as a environmental enforcement officer and not take enforcement action to maintain the experiment's integrity? Oftentimes you can't, and as a result, you may find a situation where qualitative measures, applied in a more ad hoc fashion, are really the only way to gather information there. The other thing we always have to consider is costs. To lay down a baseline and to do really extensive gathering of quantitative information can often be cost prohibitive. As a result, you may find your way you may find the need to adapt a more qualitative approach to the reality of your budget. So those are a few situations where qualitative measures really become the most important. But as I said earlier, ultimately, it's an integrated approach, I think, that makes sense. And I'll try to give a bit more detail on that as we go on. So aggregating qualitative measures, what I mean here is when you've gathered qualitative information, how do you go about making sense of it? How do you go about prepping it for its use in the decision-making process or its integration with more quantitative measures? The first thing that you can do is just really look at the narratives in their own right, I think. Look at the kinds of issues that are raised by those that are subject to interviews or observation in focus groups. Identify the strengths and weaknesses. Where are they raising concerns? Where are they not raising concerns? And oftentimes in this situation, speaking from my own experience, the things that they don't raise in the subject of these exercises is often as interesting as what they do raise. The second one is practically, in my experience, quite important, and that's the opportunity to gather anecdotal information about noncompliance. Most of us in government have an obligation to interact with political decision makers or more senior people within our organization, and often what you need to do if you want to affect change is be able to point to some kind of an anecdote, some kind of a narrative provided by someone that would, a regulatee or a citizen, that helps you paint a very real picture of what it is that you're talking about for a decision maker. You don't often have long in meetings, or you don't have the opportunity to provide volumes and volumes of information, but oftentimes one or two anecdotes gathered through a qualitative process can be very influential, and it can really help you to paint a clear picture for decision makers. The third one is a sort of a play on words, I suppose, but what I'm getting at there is that there is the opportunity, if you do enough qualitative work and it's done in a way, to put a quantitative framing around it. So you can look at your narratives, you can look at how many times specific issues are raised, you can look at how many times they're not raised, where the focus is put by regulatees in specific regions of the country, etc. And you can count those things, and it can help you to make sense of frequency and trends over time. The last bullet here is one that I mentioned a little bit earlier, in that it can help you to frame the questions that you need to ask about a new area. So when you go in cold, you don't really know what you're dealing with. You don't really know what it is that are the most important areas. A qualitative approach can help you to identify that and then better direct your resources to really specific quantitative work further down the line. Okay, so here's a couple of examples, and I'll try to make things a bit more concrete and real for you as I go through them. So a couple of areas that we regulate at Environment and Climate Change Canada are wastewater effluent and the movement of hazardous waste over international borders. And in both cases, I had some involvement with the pre-regulatory work. So when there was initial ideas about wanting to regulate in these areas and the shape and the scope of those regulations, and then as an enforcement official, I've been involved in post-regulation where we're really looking at implementation. How do we make sure regulatees comply? How do we make sure that the regulation is fully implemented? So in the pre-regulatory space, I've put quantitative and qualitative next to each other, and what I'm really trying to show is both methods had significant value in shaping the way that we proceeded. So looking at wastewater, first off, there was an enormous effort in the initial stages of pre-regulation to determine how many facilities we had in Canada, what the effluent levels are, what the nature of the effluent was that was coming out, what kinds of toxic chemicals might be present within effluent depending on the size of the city, etc., and how that related to population of cities, communities, municipalities, and municipal budgets, and treatment levels. So with wastewater effluent, there's primary, secondary, and tertiary kinds of treatment. So we needed to understand what different municipalities and communities had different kinds of treatment levels. All of that is very quantitative in nature. It's very much drawing back to counting things and mapping them out. At the same time, though, what was equally important was the qualitative element. So how did regulatees perceive the federal government regulating in this area? In Canada, as I'm sure it's the case in many of the countries around the world, I know it is in the United States, environment is really a shared jurisdiction between federal and other levels of government. It's the same in Canada. And understanding how it's perceived that the federal government is choosing to regulate in this area, and how not only regulatees but other levels of government perceive it, helps you to understand what's ultimately going to be required from an implementation standpoint. Will there be resistance? Will people welcome this? If they do resist, what form will that resistance take? And you cannot get at that information, in my view, with a purely quantitative approach. The second point is related to the first, is what is the relative priority and willingness to comply of any given community? The federal government right now in Canada, as far as wastewater goes, regulates 2,560 facilities across the country, and that number may grow in the future. Where are each of those communities? And they vary from very small communities of 200 or 300 people to the municipality of Toronto, which is Canada's largest city, in excess, I think, of 4 million people now, which, depending on where you are, that may not sound like all that big a city, but for us it is. And they all have different understandings of where wastewater should fit in their priority list. If you're on an Aboriginal community, you may be thinking about your priorities relative to the cleanliness of your drinking water. If you're in downtown Toronto, you may be thinking about investment in wastewater treatment that costs tens of millions of dollars when there is public outcry for improved transportation. Understanding how those things play off one another and through the process is absolutely essential if you want to have good implementation. And the underlying accountability structures. This one's actually more related. Well, it's certainly relevant in the wastewater space, but it's also very relevant in hazardous waste. So I'll bring up the hazardous waste example. How it is in Canada is that there's a great deal of hazardous waste that moves over the Canada-U.S. border, and there is also a great deal that moves internationally. Oftentimes, we have an issue with electronic waste, old cell phones, and those kinds of things that are illegally shipped sometimes to Asian countries. So, what is the accountability structure that is in place, and how is it perceived by the regulatees that are involved? So you cannot regulate in an effective way without understanding that, because you don't know what pressure it is that you want to put on the regulatee through the regulatory process and how that's best done. So that's the pre-regulatory space. That's the creation of the regulations themselves. Once they're in place and you're thinking about implementation, from a performance measurement standpoint, again, the best approach in our experience has been the integration of the two. You have to monitor those quantitative elements, rates of non-compliance, recidivism, as I mentioned earlier, what enforcement measures are you taking, and what impact are they having on the regulated community. From a kind of an intel perspective and a more expansive view, you want to look also quantitatively at what links certain kinds of criminality have to others. So, in the hazardous waste space, there are links of various kinds with organized crime in certain places, with the movement of hazardous waste illegally, including over international borders. You can monitor that quantitatively to some extent, and in the frequency of its existence is something you can get at quantitatively. Qualitatively, however, you need to understand the rationalizations for non-compliance, and here's where I'll bring up hazardous waste. So when most hazardous waste, I mean, people think about kind of truckloads of toxic waste in blue bins and things like that. Oftentimes it's not that. Oftentimes what it is the disposal of construction waste, which may include various kinds of old, electrical appliances and things like that, some of which contain PCBs. That's actually an issue from a hazardous waste standpoint. Now, when you look at a construction company, they may think, well, I wouldn't overtly move hazardous waste, but if it's part and parcel with a big bunch of construction waste that I'm moving, and I haven't, picked through this garbage, I can't be held responsible for that. But in fact, they can be. But what you understand from that process is their rationalization of non-compliance, and you can target your compliance promotion and your enforcement efforts in and around that thinking. And as a result, you may find out that construction waste far exceeds, more overt kinds of hazardous waste crime than you might think, and it's because it's easy to rationalize for those in that industry. What real impact do enforcement measures have? So this is one that you can understand quantitatively through looking at recidivism, but qualitatively you need to understand how that impact is felt within the industry. So if you bring to bear a fine on a large international construction company, they may barely notice that it happened. But what you can find with environmental crimes is if you're able to target those within the decision-making stratosphere of the company individually, and to bring accountability to them on an individual basis, you may understand that kind of enforcement measure has a much more direct and really important impact within the company's decision-making in the future. That's a fairly obvious example, I think, to many, but it is one that bears itself out in reality. And again, you're able to put all the kinds of criminality that I looked at in social context. So back to wastewater before I move on to the next slide. You look at various kinds of sizes and of communities in Canada and how they understand their reality to implement wastewater effluent treatment standards. And they look at that in the context of everything else that municipality may need to do. And there is a social process that comes to the fore in terms of the decision making, and it has as much to do with that community's sense of its future and what its responsibilities are and what its responsibilities aren't, in the context of their economic situation, in the context of their social cultural history. And if you don't understand that, oftentimes your enforcement measures will be ineffective, and you won't necessarily understand why. But the reality of it is your presence in that community and the way that you bring to bear your enforcement measures is not consistent with their views on how the world ought to work. So those are a couple of specific examples, and I can speak more to them if there's questions, but I hope those have helped to make things a bit more concrete. So having looked at a couple of examples, this is my sense of what the key principles are. And of course, these are open for debate. So all non-compliance takes place in a social context, and there's many nuanced and dynamic variables to it. I think you have to start from that understanding to do good performance measurement that includes quantitative and qualitative elements. Integrated use of qualitative and quantitative methods is essential. And the success depends on exploiting the strengths and weaknesses of each method. Each method has its areas that it can really draw out valuable information, but they equally have shortcomings. And it's only when they're used together that you get a broader picture of the reality of the situation. So Carl, I'll end it there and open myself up for questions.